It's one of, if not the most important aspect of any good software system. I'm of course talking about authorization. And one of the golden rules in authorization is, if you can, don't roll your own. And by that I mean don't invent your own authorization system, don't reinvent the wheel, because most of the time there's a standard way of authorizing users or external entities into your system. One of those standard frameworks for authorizing access to a system is JSON Web Tokens. JSON Web Tokens are compact, URL-safe tokens used for safely moving information between parties. They're self-contained in nature, which means that they can store really critical information such as claims, which are descriptions of what people can or can't do inside your system. They're used widespread in APIs, microservices, in a lot of applications that you log into on a daily basis. JSON Web Tokens, or JWTs, will be in use to ensure that authorization is performed accurately, quickly, and safely. So we're going to look at how to use JWTs in a C# ASP.NET application to secure your web apps or APIs. So to just introduce JWTs, we should talk about their structure. They have three different components, which are a header, a payload, and a signature. Auth0 have put together a really good explainer for JWTs, which I've got on the screen at the moment. And as you can see here, the JWT is split into three segments separated by a full stop or period. The first one is the header, and this usually has two parts, which is the type of the token and the algorithm that's in use. So these tokens will be hashed using a hashing algorithm, and this is describing what kind of hashing algorithm is in place. Obviously the type of token is JWT. This will then be base64 URL encoded to form that first segment of the token. Then the second part is the payload. This has the majority of the critical information that we need, such as what the person or the entity that's speaking to your system is allowed to do according to the JSON Web Token. So there are some what we call registered claims. These are kind of like pre-built or built-in variables that describe things about a token which can't be changed. So the issuer, for example, who's issued the token, a very important one, EXP, which is expiration time. So you can set these tokens to expire. That's a really powerful feature. For example, if you wanted to provide another system temporary access to your system, say in a microservices situation where one service is speaking to another, then they can exchange tokens, and those tokens could die after, say, a minute, so that we don't have prolonged access to the system more than we need to. And then you have public and private claims, but essentially this is where you can add your own claims. So in this example, we can see that there's a name, John Doe, so that's describing the entity, in this case a user that's trying to access. One of the claims is admin, which is a Boolean saying true or false, and in this case the JWT is describing John Doe as an admin. It's saying admin is true for John Doe. So this means that then the API could act on that information. So you could say, okay, I'm authorizing John Doe. I see that he's an admin, so I'll show these certain things on the screen. So once that's encoded, you've got the two segments separated by dots. And then you've got the final segment, which is the signature. And this is essentially the existing components, so the encoded header, the encoded payload. There's a secret as well, so you always have a predefined secret, which obviously has to remain secret. And then we use all of that information to sign the JWT. So that information is essentially creating that signature, which forms the third part of the component. And all those components put together can be used as a token in a transaction or some kind of communication between an entity in your system or another system and your system. Putting it all together, and you can see this is the output for the example being shown on the screen. And Auth0 also have a handy debugger, so you can make your own token. So I could change this to Nick Proud, and as you can see, it's encoding the token on the fly. So this is encoded based on the information or the data, the JSON that I've got on the right-hand side of the screen. So over to C# then, we've got an ASP.NET MVC application set up. So just a basic template. So if I look on the left-hand side, I've got the controllers. We've got a home controller, which is our series of endpoints. We've got some views here as well. But I'm going to start off in the program.cs. I'm going to set this application up for use of JWT, well, specifically for authorization using JWTs. So first off, we're going to need a NuGet package. So we're going to need to have Microsoft.ASP.NET Core.authentication.JWT So I'm just going to downgrade this slightly because this application is not on .NET 8 yet. So it might be different for you. So right below where we do add controllers with views, I'm going to add authentication. So builder.services.add authentication. So this will take a configure options parameter, so we can inject that in, and then we'll set up the properties on that options class. And we'll do the same thing with the default challenge scheme. Then we can chain on this add JWT bearer. So this is where we're actually enabling JWT bearer authentication, and we're using the default scheme which we've just set above. And this also takes options. So I can just close that off and then fill this in. And this is how we set the options for validating the tokens that come in. So we can say the token validation parameters are as such. So new token validation parameters, and then that will have a bunch of properties in there that we can also set. So we're telling ASP.NET how to validate the tokens that are coming in with these different options. So the first one is validate issuer. So we want to say, yeah, I want to see the issuer, make sure that is all good. Validate the audience, so we can specify whether it's the correct audience. Validate lifetime, which is a really important one, and then validate issuer signing key is true. So we're just setting all of these to true, and then it's all very well and good saying validate the issuer, but who is the issuer? Who is the audience? So these are things that we need to set here essentially. So we can actually set that, so the valid issuer, and then you can see the default underneath is builder.configuration JWT issuer. And the reason it's steering you towards that is because it's good practice to put these kinds of high-level variables in a configuration file, whether that's your app settings.json. If it's in the cloud, your app settings.json just lives in your Azure subscription and you can access it. If you're running it locally, or on-premise, then you can grab it from your app settings locally as well. Just for speed, I'm just going to hard code this in here, but just so you're aware, that isn't the best practice. I just want to be able to demonstrate this fairly quickly. So I'll say Nick Proud is the valid issuer, so obviously that issuer will need to be present on the token. The valid audience will be, I'll just put test in that, or test users. I'll put that as Pascal case for a bit of consistency. And then this is where we can use our secret. So this is in the form of the issuer signing key. So this is the key that will be used to sign the token. So that will be a new symmetric security key. And then that will need to take the bytes from a string. So get bytes, and then you'd pass in your actual password. I'm just going to say, super secure password. Obviously, I wouldn't use that in production, and it would be stored in a configuration file, which itself would likely be encrypted. But, obviously this is for demonstration purposes. So there we go. We've told .NET that we want to validate these properties, and then we've set the properties that we can. So we've set the audience, we've set the issuer, and then we've passed in the password that will be used to sign the keys, to sign the token when the token is signed on generation. At this point, you've set up your web application for JWTs. So you've made it so that you've added authentication checks using JWTs as the authentication method, and then you've gone further into that and you've configured the JWT validation options and how the token is generated. The first thing I'm going to do is create an endpoint where a token can be generated. So if we call that endpoint, it will return a JWT, which is valid for X amount of minutes, and it can be used in a different endpoint. So I'm going to go to controllers, click add, and say add controller, and I'll call this the auth controller. So I'm going to change this endpoint here to get token, and then we're going to change it to a HTTP post called get token. So I'll come back to this one in a second. Underneath this, I'm going to create a private string function called generate token. Now, say this was in a login situation, what you could do is have the user pass in their username and password. That would come through to get token, and then you can validate that password. If it's valid, you could then generate a token for them that's valid for however long, and that token can be used to access other pages. After a while, that token would be expired, and they'd have to log in again. So just to demonstrate this, actually what I'll do is I'll change this to login. I'll just change the signature as well. And then I'll just create like a stub bool password is valid string password, or user is valid string username. And then I'm just going to return true on this. Obviously, this is where you would go and validate those credentials, but it means that you could say here, if user is valid, you'd pass it in from here, but I just want to have this page load so that we can just get the token back. Then you can say, give me a token. So var token equals generate token. And then you would return that token. So let's focus on actually generating the JWT and then returning it so that we could then test this with a HTTP post. So the first thing we need to do is generate a signing key. So I'll say var signing key equals new symmetric security key. If you remember, this needs to have the password passed in for it. So I'm going to use encoding.utf8.getBytes. I just need to add a namespace for this, so it would be system.text, and then this would be the actual password that we've already set. So again, you would normally store this somewhere secure. I'm just going to use the same string for now. There we go. Then we can create some signing credentials. So I can say credentials equals new signing credentials. And you've already got it there. You've got the signing key. And then we specify an algorithm. So we can say security algorithms dot whichever algorithm you're using to do the signing, which by default HMAC SHA-256, which is absolutely fine. So now we've got everything set up so that whatever we actually add to our header and our payload for the token, we can use this to then sign that data and create the resulting token. So now we've got our key and we've got our signing credentials, we can actually go ahead and create the token that can be returned by this generate token function. So I'll set a variable called token, and that is a new JWT security token. And inside that we'll initialize some properties. So we need to set our issuer, which was Nick Proud. We need to set our audience. Again, this is the same as what we set in the program.cs. So that was test users. So claims can be a new list of, and then claim. So for now, that will actually give us just an empty list. We can import system.security.claims.claim. Now, I'm not going to add any to this, but it's very simple to do. If I was to show an example just up here in login, say I just wanted to create a new claim, I could say var claim equals new claim, and then you can see rider is giving us some IntelliSense here, some suggestions. So we can just say claim types.name and then give it a value. So if you just gave the claim a type of, well, a name of something like API user, then you could check that claim if somebody logged in through the interface, and that would say no, they can't log in, they are actually an API user. So that's the sort of thing you can use claims for. You can create this metadata which gives people certain permissions or things they're allowed to do based on their particular user or the entity itself. So I'll remove that for now, and then we've just got an empty list of claim. The next thing I want to do is say when it expires. So you can see it's suggested that we expire it in, say, 2 hours with 120 minutes. I could change that to 30 and say, this will actually expire in 30 minutes. And so that the token won't be usable after that time. And then signing credentials will give us the ability to actually sign this token as it's created. So you can see we created some signing credentials up here, which was where we passed in our key and we specified the algorithm. So we're just specifying for this token that its signing credentials will be the ones that we created here. We'll just bring that up a little bit more. And then we can simply return new JWT security token handler dot write token. So we can't just pass the token back. We have to write the token. So we call into this JWT security token handler, and it has a write token function, which will take these properties and convert it into a usable token. So the signing, for example, we've just specified how it should be done. We haven't actually done the signing, so that will take care of doing that and then encoding the token so that it can be then easily sent back to the calling code and the token can be used. Now that we've got that in place, instead of just returning a view, we actually want to return a token. So I can say return OK for status 200 OK, and then we'll return a new object, and inside that object we just have token. And then we've obviously got to do some kind of return if the user is not valid, so then we can just say return unauthorized, because the user isn't valid, therefore we know they're not authorized to actually access the system. So now that we've set this up, we could actually do a test against this post endpoint to ensure that we're actually getting a token back. So I'm just going to run this. So if I run the application, in fact, I don't want to run it. I actually want to just debug it for now, just in case anything does happen. So I've got that now running on localhost on port 5277. So I need to be able to do a post request to this application. Now you can use any REST client you want. The most common one tends to be Postman, which is fine. I use one called Insomnia because it just works really well with Linux, but the principle is pretty much the same. You just put your parameters in, your endpoint, your body, your payload, all that sort of stuff, and you get your response, and you can do that on demand. So I've got one here from before that I can just change up a little bit. So 5227, I believe it was. No, it was 5277. And then I think it was just login, and it was a post request. So let's try to send that. And you see we've hit an issue here. So this is quite a common issue because we're using a 256-bit algorithm to sign this, but the key that we've used is actually too small. It's only 152 bits. So I've had this plenty of times before. It just means that I need to make a longer key. So back in program.cs where we specified this key, again, you would have this in a central place. We just need to make this longer. So super secure password that is nice and long so that we do not see errors. There we go. So I'm hoping that that should help. Let me just copy that because I know that we're using it in auth controller. So I'm just going to stop this, debug it. So now that we've got a longer key, hopefully we won't have that issue again. So let's try this one again. And there we go. So you can see here, we've got a token that has been returned as base64. So if we were consuming this as an API, for example, in another application, we could parse this JSON, read the token field and get the value out and use that token. So that token should be valid for another 30 minutes. Let's actually protect something then. So let's go over to controllers. We can add a new one. So add controller, and I'm going to call this data controller. So this could be some controller where we're hosting some information that can be retrieved with a get endpoint. I'm going to make this an API controller. So you can see here the root attribute that we can put in. And I've put an attribute here as well for API controller. So this will sit on the base URL /API / the name of the controller. So if I actually just returned, okay, here's some data, then if I run this, I should just be able to navigate to the controller URL and see that text. There you go. So API /data, here's some data. So let's say, for example, I didn't want people to just get this data without being pre-authorized or verified. They need to authenticate to get this data. So because we've added authorization to this project in the form of JWTs, we should be able to just say authorize, and that will now protect this endpoint against people trying to access it who don't have a token. So back on the page, if I try to do that again, so if I go to API /data, you can see I can't actually get to that page. I get a 401 forbidden or unauthorized, whichever one it is. I can't remember off the top of my head, but it's essentially not letting me in. Now, one thing I forgot to do on this was to actually give this a dedicated endpoint, because actually I don't want it to just go to the index. I want to be able to call get data or some kind of concrete endpoint. And then that means I can give this a HTTP GET attribute. So I'm being very clear here that there is a GET endpoint called getData. And then I'm going to call this and go to that. Then I'm going to get rid of this. So now I've just got getData for this one. So I'm going to try calling login. So now I've got that token again. And then I'm going to try and call API data again, and this time I'll pass in the token, and I need to change it to a get, and there you go, here's some data. So I've only been able to get that because that token was present. If I remove this, then you can see it goes back to unauthorized. Put it back in again, here's some data. So if you've got like a controller based application like MVC, something you can put an authorized attribute on, so you could probably do this in Blazor as well, then you can add authentication to that ASP.NET web app and specify that your authentication type is JSON Web Tokens. And that way you can protect them with these standardized time-limited tokens that are fairly simple to set up, but protect the data with proven authentication schemes. But this was just a high-level demo. If you've got more questions or you want me to dive deeper into the subject, then please do let me know in the comments below. And don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel, because it does help me to bring you lots of great .NET content. But until next time, thanks for watching.